Okay, so before we start with the discussion on Lance Armstrong, which hopefully everybody's watched, you will have noticed that I've given you all 10 out of 10 for your marks in your film study, which is totally appropriate because it was an opinion piece. It wasn't something that actually had a right or a wrong answer to it. So I was glad to give those marks to you. The answers were all great. I mean, obviously, you guys paid attention to the movie Concussion. You got the points that I was looking for you to basically make, and most particularly to highlight, how a professional sport like the NFL protected the sport itself, ahead of, to a great degree, the individual injuries of its players, until it was virtually forced to acknowledge the tremendous damage that concussions take place on the field, and they still do. Although now, they know, essentially the kind of damage that's done, and to try to prevent it to some degree, and they've changed some rules in the game to do that. Anyway, it was a really good movie. I enjoyed it. It's Will Smith, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it too. And clearly you got a lot out of it because your film studies were absolutely excellent. So good for you. Before we likewise do the discussion on Armstrong, I can tell you that when at the beginning of the lecture tonight, I'll have a couple of points to make with respect to final exams, final paper, and the group presentations. So that'll be at the beginning of the lecture. So let's turn now to the Lance Armstrong documentary. There's a number of documentaries out there that have been done on Armstrong because he was such a polarizing figure when it came to the revelation that he was doping during 7 races, where in fact he essentially got around the doping rules for the Tour de France that were put in place. And a lot of these rules were put in place specifically to target the kinds of things he was doing. So does anybody have any observations or opinions on what they saw with respect to the documentary I had you watch before class? Genwan?
Professor, after I watched the video, I can have like a 2 comment and 1 question of this video. Like the first comment is like Lance Armstrong defend himself in the scandal of taking doping. So he's proposed that the definition of cheating is to gain an average over opponents by some means. And he believes that if all athletes using the drugs, then the relative advantage does not exist anymore. So an individual taking banned drugs it should not consider as cheating. So in fact, what he uses is relative electrical thinking, which makes people feel that he's actually changing the concept, turning a legal issue into a philosophical issue. And the second comment is I had some feeling after I watched his interview with the BBC News. So Lance Armstrong also made some of the shocking points in the interview with BBC in 2015. So the first point is that he proposed that 20 years ago, the use of doping was very common at that time. So, which means that at that time, more than one athlete using doping for sure. And the second point is that he proposed that if the time can come back, he will still choose to use doping medicine because it has their own logic value. And he also has his own logic. So he doesn't think his choice is illegal and wrong. And my question is, in the 2015 BBC interview with Lance Armstrong, he mentioned that his choice to use doping was decided by him and his team together. According to the law of the United States, if Lance is permanently banned, will other members of his team also banned from participate in athlete service work, or
Yes.
will they be banned from participate in any work? So, for example, some of the nutritionists or physical fitness coaches or physicians or some of the people in that team probably doesn't even know his decision.
That's I think he was very, very careful on trying to keep the what he was doing and what select members of his team were doing with respect to doping. So, there may well have been, more members of the team more broadly, like nutritionists, although I would think that they would know because nutrition is important with respect to the doping infraction. But there may have been people on this team who didn't know, and I don't know if there were or not. Everybody who admitted to it, however, has been punished. And with respect to your point about him not thinking that doping, should be illegal, right? We're going to talk about that tonight in the lecture, because he was quite correct. At one point, there was, and it still is. I mean, the Russians clearly doped in the Sochi Olympics, the Winter Olympics, and they were punished for that. But they still do it, basically on the premise that they won't be adequately punished. And there's been lots of other, and again, we'll talk about it tonight, lots of other instances where countries, Eastern European countries like East Germany before the wall came down, that kind of thing, that made it part of the state policy to dope, to basically, obviously, to win international events. And we're going to see in tonight's lecture how, in fact, that doping actually was encouraged in the early days of widely known sports, and we'll see how that happens. Any other comments on the video? No, really? I'm surprised. Oh, Jim, one again? Okay, go ahead.
Sir, one of the questions I have again is like, for all his team members, will they ban it for only service for athletes, or will they ban it for all the jobs?
Oh, anybody who participated in it and acknowledged that or is found guilty of that is going to be subject to whatever the WADA infraction guidelines are. So it's not something that that is swept under the carpet by any means. Anybody else? All right, guys. Let's then go to the lecture. All right. Okay, so let's here's a few comments before we actually start in the content of the lecture. So the final exam, maybe you've seen it. I haven't seen a final exam schedule yet. Has anybody seen one online from the registrar's office? Yes, no? I haven't seen one. It will come out shortly. It tends to be for a summer course to be on a night that is a regular scheduled night. So our last class is going to be on the 14th of June, which is 2 weeks from tonight. So don't be surprised if the final exam is going to be on the 21st of June, kind of thing. So let's keep, because the last class is June the 8th. The last week of classes ends June the 18th. All right, so the final exam is going to be very, very straightforward, very simple. It will take you like half an hour to do this exam if this is what you choose to do. It's only going to be 30 multiple choice questions and 10 short answer fill in the blank questions. I'll give you an hour. You won't need that. So it'll be a Google form. So I'll send it to you. You send it back to me, and the results will be, the multiple choice questions will be answered right away. And the short answer ones I'll do physically. Kyle, hands up.
How long of an answer would you expect for the short answer questions?
The short answer questions?
Yes, like how long of an answer would you expect?
They're virtually fill in the blank.
Okay.
So there's no essay component or short answer that's any more than 1 or 2 words to fill in the blank in a sentence. So again, very, very straightforward, and you guys shouldn't have much problem with it at all. All right. The final paper, I've put the instructions on Moodle for the final paper. Most final papers I usually ask to be in the order of 8 pages long. I'm only asking for this one to be 5 pages. It's a summer course. I don't expect you to spend, an inordinate amount of time preparing for it. So it's on Moodle. The last day to give me your topics, if you didn't want to do the topic that I've posted for you, which is a doping topic, actually. If you didn't want to use that topic, then I was to receive your own suggestions by last Friday, and I've received some of those. All right. If you still think you want to do your own topic and you haven't let me know that, please let me know right away so I can record that. Okay. And group presentations, again, they'll all take place on the class 2 weeks from tonight on June the 14th. All right. So, for the purposes of the presentations, you've now been divided into your groups. So you're in one of 3 groups. The groups have all chosen their topics, and we've confirmed all of that. Okay. And so, you have a couple of weeks now. Hopefully you started working on it last week if you had the chance to get together, because I've distributed everybody's email address. So hopefully, you're going to get this together. The whole idea is, you are to educate me and the rest of the class on the very specific event. It could be an athletic event, or it could be an athlete, him or herself, those kind of things. So, and hopefully you're using visual aids, PowerPoint, YouTube, whatever it's going to be. And the presentation should be in the order of 15 to 20 minutes in length. All right. They will be graded by both me and your classmates. So I will distribute a Google form for that purpose before the presentations take place. Any questions about the exam, the paper, and or the presentations? You good? All right. Okay, so doping in sport. All right, so doping in very broad terms is just quite simply this definition: the use of a substance or method banned by WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Agency, which, by the way, was essentially the genesis of WADA was basically from a Canadian who worked out, it was a lawyer who established this in his office in Montreal. So it has a very significant Canadian connection. All right, here is a very brief doping control video actually produced by WADA.
Doping control is an essential part of anti-doping programs to promote and protect the integrity of sport and the health of athletes. Testing is carried out in accordance with the World Anti-Doping Code and a series of international standards. Hi, I am a doping control officer, also known as a DCO. I play a major role in protecting your rights in the doping control process, which consists of 5 phases. Athlete selection, athlete notification, sample collection, sample analysis, and results management. How can you be selected for testing? Testing can be conducted in 2 situations: in competition and out of competition. For in-competition testing, the selection may occur in a number of ways, including by random selection, based on finishing position, or by being targeted for a particular reason. For out-of-competition testing, you may be tested anytime, anywhere, with no advance notice. If you have been identified in a registered testing pool, you will be required to provide whereabouts information. You may be tested at home, at your training location, or other relevant locations. How will you be notified? The notification process is the same for both in and out of competition testing. If you are selected for testing, I will show you my DCO accreditation to demonstrate that I am authorized to conduct testing. I will also explain your rights and responsibilities in the doping control process and ask you to sign a form. Once you have been notified, you must report immediately to the doping control station. You may request a delay for a valid reason, such as you are taking part in a medal ceremony. You must attend a press conference. You require medical treatment. Upon notification, a DCO or chaperone will stay at your side at all times until the testing process has been completed. What is the sample collection process? During this process, you also have specific rights, such as having a representative with you, as well as certain responsibilities. I will first ask you for a valid photo ID to confirm your identity. You will be asked to provide 1 or more urine samples and/or blood samples. When you are ready to provide a urine sample, A doping control official of the same gender as you will witness the passing of the sample and will stay with you until you provide a sample that meets all requirements. You will then be asked to divide the urine sample into B and A bottles and then seal them. Throughout the process, you will be the only one to handle the sample collection equipment, unless you require assistance. Finally, you will be asked to review and sign the doping control form. The samples and a copy of the form that does not disclose your identity will be sent to a WADA-accredited laboratory, while the other copies will go to the relevant anti-doping organizations. A copy of the form will also be provided to you. How are the samples analyzed? Once your A sample arrives at the laboratory, it will be opened and analyzed. The B sample will be securely stored. Should the A sample reveal an adverse analytical finding, the B sample will be analyzed to confirm the result. How are the results managed? The lab will report the results to the anti-doping organization responsible for results management. A copy will be sent to WADA to ensure the accountability of the process. In the event of an adverse analytical finding, your rights include requesting and attending the B sample analysis within set deadlines, a fair hearing, and the right to an appeal. As an essential deterrent, a standard doping control process across all countries helps protect the right of athletes to compete on a level playing field in the true spirit of sport.
Shivani, your hand is up?
Oh yeah, just a quick question.
Sure.
So like what kind of substance are they looking for and why?
Well, we're going to go through that. Yeah, there's a whole list of substances. So we're going to go through that in the lecture.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, so sit tight and we'll get there. Thank you. Okay, let's see now. So, okay, so doping is and I'm going to try to do this so I have the broader screen for you guys. Hopefully this works. So doping is a disciplinary issue. So it's covered by administrative law. So we did all of this last week in our last class on Wednesday. So doping, falls within the rules for the most part of the sports themselves. Okay, so they handle it. They punish people for it, right? And they're responsible for it. So you're already familiar with how that works when it comes to what are called private tribunals, right? So for Canada, doping first became a national issue with this guy. Anybody know who this is? Anybody recognize him? Okay, this is Ben Johnson. He is probably the most notorious, infamous athlete that Canada has ever produced. The reason is this. In 1988, in the Seoul Olympics in South Korea, basically he set the world limit in the 100-meter sprint. He was the fastest man on the planet. I remember this because I was in a bar in Toronto watching it in 1988, right? And everybody just went crazy. I mean, the bar erupted, and I'm sure they did all across Canada because, for the first time, a Canadian sprinter was the fastest man in the world. The next day, however, he tested positive for the steroid stanozolol, right, which is a performance-enhancing drug. And he also admitted to basically taking Dianabol, testosterone, and Firazabol, HGH. Right, so he admitted to all those things. So for a Canadian, this was tragedy. This was like for all the greatness we felt and the pride in our country and our pride in Ben Johnson himself for winning, being the fastest man in the world, that was crushed and taken away from us. So it really did feel like a loss, a personal loss for, all the Canadians who had been watching it or following it. So he was stripped of his gold medal and the world record. And having said that, it then went to the second place finisher, who was Carl Lewis. Carl Lewis was also taking steroids for the Olympics, but it was covered up by the United States Olympic Committee. So he never lost his gold medal, even though he later admitted to taking this exact same steroids as Ben Johnson, right? So in the record book for the Olympics, the 1988 Summer Olympics, Carl Lewis is still shown as the winner of the gold record and the fastest man in the world, right? But, and this goes now to Gen 1's comments regarding Lance Armstrong. The use of performance-enhancing substances has not always been a problem. In fact, in the days of the Greeks and the Romans, right, it was actually encouraged for spectator sports. There was special seating in arenas like that for those people who could come into the arena itself and provide mandrake for the use of athletes, right? So mandrake was a herb, but it was a performance-enhancing herb. Chariot drivers drank herbal infusions to inhibit their fear, right? So when they're in the Colosseum racing like this, behind the horses, trying to beat the other chariot racers in an incredibly dangerous sport, right? They were given drugs to reduce their level of fear so that they would basically be as energetic and as piped up, as jacked up for it as they could possibly be. More recently, in the 1800s, so now fast forward a couple of thousand years, right? You have long distance walkers, right, who are openly given drugs. And laudanum was given to walkers, which is an opiate, right? It's a form of an opiate, was given to walkers to help keep them awake over what was a week-long event. And over time, the same effect was sought for long distance bike riders. And this is something that Lance Armstrong alluded to, is that, it wasn't always the case where, doing these long distance marathon races, there wasn't the opportunity to enhance your performance by taking drugs. In France, the soigneurs assigned to racers, and they still have those positions, were assigned to racers, again, in long distance racing, and give them nitroglycerin to stimulate their heart, and cocaine for extra energy. All of this perfectly and openly out for everybody to see. In 1904, so now we're talking 117 odd years ago, Tom Hicks won the marathon, the walking, the marathon. This is a picture of him here, right? And Hicks' trainer, a guy named Charles Lucas, while Hicks was still on the track or on the road, wherever he was doing this long distance marathon, he pulled out a syringe and came to his aid, because Hicks was starting to fatigue, was starting to struggle. And here's what the trainer said: "I therefore decided to inject him with 1 milligram of sulfate of strychnine," which is a poison, "and to make him drink a large glass brimming with brandy. He set off again as best he could, but he needed another injection 4 miles from the end to give him a semblance of speed and to get him to the finish." Right? Now, again, fast forward a bit, 1960 Mexico Olympics. Right? That sounds like a long time ago to you, but it's certainly within my lifetime. So it's something that is within my memory. I was very young though, so not my actual memory that I can recall, but I do know of the Mexico Olympics. And this was the first Olympics when this started to be using blood infusions. Blood infusions basically to again enhance performance. Having said that, since then and over the course of the last 50 years, there's been, and it's been general, an acknowledgement that gradually took hold, basically saying that banned substances in fact cause a harm. All right. But over the course of the last 50 years, their use has been in fact been very well hidden. And one example, and I mentioned this a little earlier tonight, is East Germany. East Germany was a communist country separated from West Germany after the Second World War, up to including 1991 when the Berlin Wall came down, right? And so what East Germany did is it closed itself off from any outside sporting scrutiny, up to including 1965. Right? They would not allow anyone to test their athletes, right? Now that's a shot putter. Her name is Ilona Slobanic-Ek. She's a shot putter. She tested positive for steroids in the 1977 European Cup. So now we're talking about the 70s, right? What happened at that point is that the International Amateur Athletics Federation suspended her for 12 months, right? She returned to East Germany during that period of time. She was free to train unchecked, which means she's still she still took performance enhancing drugs to, bulk up her weight and her strength. And she returned to win a gold medal at the next European Cup. All right. So her doping infraction in no way, made it had a detrimental impact upon her returning to the athletic arena. After German reunification in 1993, it was learned that the Stasi was in charge of East German sports. The Stasi is the secret service for East Germany. Right? It would not be unlike the CIA, in the U.S. if that was a case. It's not, of course, but that's the kind of thing it was. So it was, in fact, it was a state policy of East Germany to, in fact, dope their athletes. All right. So in the modern day, we have, this is after Ben Johnson in '88, there was a royal inquiry called to be run by Mr. Charles Dubin, who was formerly a member of the Ontario Court of Appeal. And Dubin was hired, for this public inquiry called a royal inquiry to look into how could Canada be so embarrassed by Ben Johnson and that doping scandal, and what could be done to fix it going forward, right? And what Dubin came up with was the establishment of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, which is responsible in Canada for the implementing and monitoring doping policy. So that's our internal agency. Drug Test Administration is done according to WADA. Okay, so WADA is the international agency, basically. And having said that, and this is really important to make a note of, sports organizations, in Canada are not mandated to follow WADA, right? And the agency created by Justice Charles Dubin, they are not required to do that, except if the sports are competing in the Olympics or the sports depend upon federal funding. So the NBA, the MLB, all of these groups do not have to follow the WADA doping policies, all right? Doping policy is part of the sport organization's contract. Again, we talked a lot about that last day. So, whatever league you're involved in, again, MLB, NHL, what have you, NFL, whatever you're playing in, basically you belong to that organization. You have to follow its, basically the social contract amongst themselves, which includes their constitution and bylaws and rules and regulations. And those rules and regulations include their own internal policies for doping. In 1983, this was the first time that the International Olympic Committee introduced a list of banned substances. Okay, so Shivani, this is for you to answer your question. So this is the first time a list actually came out of what in fact was banned, right? However, many countries did not follow with a national code of their own banned substances until the late 1990s. And and there still are, and here are the differences from country to country. So firstly, was the infraction declared, and this is somebody who is found to have used a banned substance, declared at the time of testing or after all the appeals are exhausted? So that's different from country to country, right? Two, who had the onus of proving the infraction, right? Was it the league itself? Was it somebody on a team? Was it a coach, a manager, that kind of thing? And what are the nature of the penalties for doping? And again, we're going to see in a little later in this lecture what the various penalties are between the sports that we're all familiar with, right? So this brings us to the 1998 Tour de France and the WADA policies. Again, now we're dealing with Lance Armstrong, right? And so that's just a clip of the racers, right? And here's what came out of the 88 Tour de France. A Dutch newspaper alleged that 7 of the 8 riders on the Dutch team in 88 were using banned substances. Volkskrant has published extracts from the notebook used by the soigneur Bertus Falk during the race. He was a soigneur for the Dutch team, in which he details the substances administered to the riders. His notebook, with photographs which were published on the news information's website, Volkskrant, provides details of the substances he administered to his riders during the tour. The substances and practices used by these Dutch riders on the race included testosterone, corticosteroids, and blood transfusions. Okay, and here's the development of blood as a way to get dope into you, right? So here's what the rationale, and we're going to again talk about more about actual types of substances further. But here's the rationale for having an anti-doping policy. So this again goes back to the earlier questions regarding the Armstrong documentary, as in, is there a rationale that there should be an anti-doping policy, right? You and I, we think of that now as a no-brainer, really. Sure, there has to be an anti-doping policy. Doping is wrong. Doping is harmful. Doping gives advantages to athletes that shouldn't have that advantage. So absolutely, it's wrong. Well, that's not necessarily what the arguments say. So here are the three premises of why there should be an anti-doping policy. One is harm to the athletes. Two, it unfairly tilts the playing field. And three, it's against what's called, in quotes, the spirit of sport. So let's look at these individually. So the counter rationale to all of these is this. One, athletes should be allowed to enhance their performance to achieve the best possible human results. Again, that's something that Armstrong argued in the documentary you watched, right? And this is what this is basically saying is, doping wouldn't harm any particular athletes in the playing field, if everybody doped and they did it with medical supervision and they did it carefully and what have you. So why should athletes not be allowed to enhance their performance, right? And so if you removed the anti-doping restrictions that are in place and basically said, okay, so doping is perfectly allowable, right? Then all the sports and their teams and the physicians on the teams and what have you, they would all very professionally ensure that their players or their athletes were doping. And so you wouldn't have to worry about who doped and who didn't. You just assume that everybody doped, right? And therefore you would no need to test anybody for anything. The second thing is that where the harm was that it tilts the playing field in favor of those who dope. Well, if everybody can dope, then the playing field becomes level for everybody. Absolutely. I mean, if you don't give somebody an advantage, but you allow everybody to have an advantage, then there's no tilting of the playing field. And lastly, it's against the spirit of the sport. Well, the spirit of sport is to win, right? So if the spirit of sport is to win, why would you not, be allowed to win with whatever means you have at your disposal, right? So those are the counter arguments. They aren't arguments that win the day, but they certainly are, arguments that are worthy of some consideration, right? So in Canada, a doping infraction occurs with one of these two things. One, that there's found to be a use of a prohibited substance, or two, there's a refusal to provide a sample. All right, now, if you look at that, that's a very common way to approach the use of a substance in a particular event. Can anybody think of another circumstance, this is outside the world of sports, where this kind of regime is in place that deals with penalties for doing something wrong? So either, okay, so let me just see here. Kyle?
Refusing to submit to a breathalyzer test?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good answer. So that's exactly right. Under the criminal code, you either provide a sample, right? And then obviously the sample will be taken to the side of the road. And then if it tests positive, they'll take you to the station where you'll do an actual breathalyzer test. But if you refuse on the side of the road to provide a sample, you will be guilty of that offense with exactly the same penalties as if you had blown over 0.8 milligrams of alcohol in 100 milliliters of blood. You will actually have, exactly the same penalty. So there is no advantage to not providing a sample. As a matter of fact, you will automatically be guilty, right? So you don't have any benefit of, perhaps passing a test, if in fact it goes all the way to a breathalyzer. All right. So here's what our penalties are in Canada. First offense, a 2-year suspension. Second offense, a lifetime suspension, and federal funding for athlete permanently lost. Now, again, remember, these are the penalties for those sports that basically have to abide by the WADA guidelines, which are sports that, that are international, like the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games or the Pan Am Games, and in any one of those sports, chances are highly, highly likely you're going to be funded by the federal government, Sports Canada. So, those are the risks you take if you're caught doping or refusing to dope. There are 4 elements of a doping policy. Whether there was proof of intent to dope, whether that's necessary, whether the substance or method has performance enhancing effects. 3, the onus and the standard of proof as to who finds somebody who's been doping, who's responsible for that. And lastly, the issue of out of competition testing. So these are 4 elements of doping policies. We're going to go through these. So the first one is intention. The first question to ask is, must there be intention? Okay, and this is really important. If you think about it, and for those of you who have a little bit of criminal justice background, and a lot of you do in the law and justice program, if you're charged with a criminal offense, right, then you are not going to be found guilty of that offense unless you had what's called what? Anybody? What element of the mind do you have to be found guilty of a criminal offense? Okay, it's called the mens rea, right? The guilty mind, right? So, is that transferable to the field of doping, right? So, must there be an intention, as in a criminal offense, must you have the guilty mind to dope, right? That's the question. And then what that gives rise to is this: what about inadvertent consumption, right? What if you somehow ingested a substance and you didn't know about it, right? And that in fact does happen, right? And this guy here is a perfect example of this. So that's a guy named Dan Corbett, right? Who basically competed at the 1994 Commonwealth Games. He ingested a mislabeled vitamin supplement, right? He absolutely did nothing intentionally wrong. He just, unfortunately, somehow rather got a hold of a supplement, in a box or a bottle that was mislabeled, right? And he also, before he took it, he also asked Canadian Commonwealth Games doctors and officials, right, and of the Canadian Centre for Excellence in Sport. They told him the product did not contain banned substances. So how much more can this guy do? First off, he's taking something that wasn't labeled, showing that there was any banned substances in it. And then he went to the experts in the field who deal with this stuff and said, I would just want to make sure, because I'm for whatever reason I'm taking this vitamin supplement, is it banned? And he was told by the experts it wasn't. And as it turned out, they were all wrong. The substance, had ephedrine in it, right? And he was stripped of 3 bronze medals that he won at those games. So, what does that tell you about intent? Tells you that intent is absolutely unnecessary. Here's another example of an athlete who takes the position that he was found to have doped totally unintentionally.
The Toronto Blue Jays have a black mark on their roster tonight. For the first time, one of the team's players has been suspended for performance-enhancing drugs. First baseman Chris Colabello has failed a drug test. He has never been described as a superstar, but last year, during the Jays' remarkable run to the playoffs, Colabello was on his game. Now his teammates and fans are left wondering if he was on anything else. Havard Gould has our story tonight.
Chris Colabello, after struggling for years to stick it in the big leagues, finally broke out last year.
Oh, God, really?
At age 31, becoming a key part of an amazing season, including playoff action with the Toronto Blue Jays. But this season started badly, perhaps because he was playing with a secret. He had failed a drug test during spring training weeks ago.
And have to try to go out and play with what he was dealing with. The game's already hard enough as is, and him trying to go out the field and try to hit with that 800-pound gorilla on his back, I can't imagine what he was going through.
Now he is suspended 80 games for steroid use. Colabello said in a statement that finding out the test results was one of the scariest times of his life. I was informed by the Players Association that a banned substance was found in my urine, he said. I have spent every waking moment since that day trying to find an answer as to why or how. The impact on the Blue Jays can only be guessed at. Baseball, almost from birth, has been Colabello's passion. His story inspired his teammates.
Everybody feels for the guy. Everybody's disappointed, but he's one of the favorites on the team.
And fans who have endured a mediocre start to this season were shocked to learn today that one of their favorites is now going to be out of the lineup for months.
He is? Come on, what did he do? He's someone you look up to and everything, and then he pulls that, right?
It's believed Colabello has already appealed his suspension and lost.
The thing he was tested positive for, which I can't pronounce, is basically the 80s steroids that the East Germans were using on their wrestling teams. So it's kind of hard to believe he took it by accident.
And so, after the Blue Jays and Canadian baseball fans everywhere enjoyed a feel-good run last year, there is no doubt that this year now feels very different. Howard Gould, CBC News, Toronto.
And just like we saw last week when we watched the Ray Rice situation, where he beat his girlfriend and then had his suspension overturned. He never played football again, Ray Rice, because the team never picked him up. Same thing for Colabello. He never came back to play for the Blue Jays, and no other team would pick him up as an athlete. So what that tells you, obviously, is that no matter what the league puts in place as a penalty, it may not by any means be the end of the road for the kind of punishment you actually have to go over. So and again, Colabello, just like the wrestler in the Commonwealth Games, the position is that they didn't know that they were taking a banned substance. Right now, the wrestler's case was, or the weightlifter, whatever he was, was certainly more sympathetic than Colabello, because it appears that that it would have been very difficult for Colabello not to know this particular drug was in the system. It wasn't like it was a mislabeled vitamin supplement. This was a drug. So there's no leeway for much forgiveness in that situation. But what the test for intention is in the world of doping is, it's called strict liability, which means it makes zero difference, whether you know or do not know that you're ingesting a substance, or somebody surreptitiously ingests it into you while you're sleeping. For God knows. I mean, it makes zero difference. It's strict liability. If the banned substance is found in your body, you are guilty of doping, right? And you will have to face the consequences. That's strict liability, right? Again, compare it to criminal law, right? Things like impaired driving. Now the difference is, right, in criminal law, is that if you have to have the intention to commit a crime, or you have to be so grossly negligent to basically turn away from the prospect that a crime will be committed, right? Which isn't what happens in doping, right? And the difference is this: the loss of liberty. Right? There is nothing more serious that the Canadian state can do to an individual in the event of a crime than deprive them of their liberty. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago about penalties and what have you, right? And so, that, under the terms of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, has been found to require a guilty mind before you can be convicted, right? The Charter, doesn't apply to sporting events and doping policy, all right? But having said that, it almost has the same effect, as in, if it's a criminal act, you lose your liberty. If you're an athlete, you're going to lose the opportunity to compete, right? Which is pretty comparable. It is the end of your world as you know it, right? Is that fair? Well, they don't care if it's fair in real terms. They take the position that it is a strict liability matter, and that's all there is to it. Fairness doesn't play into it, all right? There are two exceptions to strict liability, but they only go to penalty only, not to the actual finding of doping. And they are this: that there was an absolute lack of fault or carelessness by the athlete, right? Or the athlete must show how the substance was ingested, and a lack of knowledge doesn't apply. So, the athlete has to either show that they were so careless in whatever they did that they accidentally ingested the substance, and they had to be able to prove that to the doping agency or the league that in fact is imposing the doping policy. right? So, and those do not go to the fact that they are found to have been doping, because that's already essentially a conviction that's already held against them. But what this will do, if you're incredibly negligent in what happened or careless, then it can somehow mitigate your penalty to something lesser than the suspensions and or the the permanent rescission of your ability to play. All right. The second element is the performance enhancing effect. So does the substance or the method being blood transfusions, what have you, does the substance or the method have to be proven to enhance performance? So for instance, what if the athlete, takes a substance that in fact is banned, but because of their own metabolism, the way their body works, he or she can prove that the substance had absolutely no performance enhancing abilities. It didn't give them an edge. It didn't make their ability to compete better, essentially, right? Is that an important consideration, right? Which goes to the heart of what doping is trying to stop, which is in fact, again, tilting the playing field. And the answer to this is exactly the same as the first answer about intent, right? It's a strict liability offense as well. So it doesn't matter whether the doping substance does you any good or not. You are still guilty of doping, right? Having said that, all of these things have to be taken into account with respect to how effective doping is, or the particular substance is. The nature of the sporting event, how much substance was taken, when was the substance taken, as in how long ago, or how close to the actual event itself, the rate of dissipation in the particular athlete's body, the size of the athlete, of course, and the rate of metabolism. Those will all go to how effective the doping substance is. But again, it doesn't matter. It is still strict liability. Okay. And who has the onus of proof? Who has the onus of proof in these cases? The onus is on the sporting authority. All right. So this is like the onus is on the prosecution to show that there was a positive result. In order to do that, they have to show basically the evidence of proper sample collection, a chain of custody, and the lab results are verifiable. So not unlike that video I showed you at the beginning of the lecture produced by WADA on the 5 elements of their policy, right? So, and these are the test methods. And again, we saw a bit of this in the video. So the athlete is going to be asked for a urine sample. The sample is divided into A and B containers. If the substance is prohibited in the A container, then the athlete has the right to ask for a new test on the B container. And it doesn't have to be in the same laboratory as the A container, right? And that has been an issue over the course of time in some countries because, different labs have been shown to be more, efficient in their testing than other labs. And we saw a bit of that in the documentary on Armstrong. All right, so that's an important consideration. Olympics only have the right to retest for up to 8 years after the event. Okay, so the 2012 Olympics, right, which was London, I think. I'm not sure it was London, but whatever samples have been stored since then, because it's now 9 years ago since then, nobody can have their sample tested and have it affect their winnings if they won an Olympic medal, silver, gold, or silver, right? Or silver, gold, or bronze, right? However, once a substance is found to have been, tested and proven, then the onus shifts to the athlete to disprove the proper procedures were taken, right? To challenge things like the chain of custody and what have you. Chain of custody is really important. That's why, and again, we saw this in the WADA video. When you go to give your sample, right, you go into the bathroom stall, and the WADA representative is in there with you, right, watching you give your sample. All right, so that's the chain of custody. Now, the standard of proof for finding and disproving a banned substance, we have these 2 very well-known criminal standards of proof: the criminal standard and the civil standard. Anybody? What is the criminal standard of proof? Anybody? What does the prosecution have to prove in order to find somebody guilty? Shivani?
Prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
Excellent, thank you. Anybody know what the civil standard of proof is?
The balance of probability.
It is. Thank you very much. So great. Now, in the case of doping, they have a totally unique standard of proof, and it's called this. The agency who is alleging the doping must prove to a comfortable satisfaction, right, that the athlete is guilty of doping, right? That's their very own standard of proof. It's not, you don't find that anywhere else. So it's not the criminal standard of proof. But if the athlete wants to disprove the test that the A sample gave rise to, then the standard has to disprove the process, i.e. the chain of command, the chain of custody was broken, what have you, on, just as Shivani was saying, the civil standard on a balance of probabilities. So nowhere in the doping arena is there any room for anything to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the criminal standard of proof, all right? And lastly, we have what's called in competition versus out of competition testing, right? It's really, really important to keep these in mind because it really does affect, the efficacy of testing. So credible anti-doping programs must use out of competition testing. Right? And the reason for that is that athletes can easily manage consumption of substances out of competition so as to not test positive in the competition itself, which simply means this. If somebody has a competition coming up, say at the beginning of August, right, and there's no out of testing in place, then they can dope as much as they want, right, up until whatever date they know that the substance itself will dissipate out of their bodies. But during that entire time they were doping, they were doing weightlifting, they were running, they were building their body and their muscle strength, right, as a function of their ability to do so. Just like anabolic steroids will create a lot of muscle mass, right? And if there is no out of competition testing, then you can go ahead and do all of that, just as long as you are sure, and you have to rely upon medical advice for this, is that by the time you actually get to whatever event is taking place at the beginning of August, that if you win, and you obviously have to be tested if you win, that it won't come up with a positive result. And that's what that is. Steroids can be used for training and then be discontinued, right? So out of the system. So if you are an athlete, right, and and again, these rules are all part of the leagues or the Olympics, whatever the organization is. It's all part of their the social contract for how they operate. Is it a human rights issue to be tested out of competition? Right, so the competition, is I'm an athlete. I'm an amateur athlete, and Olympic athletes are supposed to be amateur athletes. Although in the last 30 years they've allowed all kinds of professional athletes to join. But up until the mid 1970s, you couldn't compete in the Olympics if you were a professional athlete. You couldn't be a member of Team Canada, in basketball if you played for the Raptors or any other NBA team, that kind of thing. But that's all changed now. But if say I am an amateur athlete, I'm going to the Tokyo Olympics in July, right? But they're still scheduled to be on. That's it. I train all year for that. But I'm going to be at the Olympics for 2-3 weeks, however long they go in July. And then I'm subject to, somebody knocking at my door next February and say they want a sample from you. Is that a human rights issue? Does anybody see a problem with that? Yes, no? Well, it is, an issue of privacy, right? So the question becomes, and these are for the athletes to decide these on their own, are they prepared as athletes to give up that privacy, knowing full well that in order for them to compete in whatever games they're training for, that by competing and hopefully winning in those games, you give up some bit of your own personal privacy, to be subject to testing at the will of somebody else, right? So those are personal decisions, but ones that athletes have to make all the time. Okay, so Shivani, if you turn to page 85 in the textbook, there is a list of banned substances. It's box 5.1, in your textbook, and all the substances are divided into groups. You have stimulants, you have narcotic analgesics, you have anabolic androgenic steroids, and diuretics. And under each one of those headings I just read out to you, all the kinds of drugs that fall within those categories are described, what they do for the body, and how they enhance performance. So those are there. So those are banned, restricted substances and banned methods, which is again how they are applied, right? So again, professional sports and drug testing are not bound by WADA policies. Okay, so they can't impose their will on professional sports. Against professional sports are their own environment, are their own private tribunal, just like we discussed at length last week. So they have their own rules, and that's why they're different, right? So leagues differ with respect to what substances are banned, usually only steroids, whether there's out-of-use competition done, it's rarely done actually, and the nature of penalties for doping. So let's take a look at these. Okay. So in hockey, this is the first time banned substances were actually found. Sean Hill, who played for the New York Islanders, was found to have a banned substance, steroids, in his body in 2007. He was the first hockey player ever suspended. All right. Zenon Konopka, Minnesota Wild, in 2013 was the second player suspended. So there's 6 years difference between those two suspensions. Right, so there hasn't been a lot of suspensions in the NHL. The testing regime is this. The test athletes are subject to random tests 3 times per year. It's a urine analysis only, so there's no testing of blood. Testing on off days, or testing is only done on off days during the season, so not a game day, right? And there's no testing, this is really important, no testing during playoffs or in the off season, right? So we're in the hockey playoffs right now, so there are no testing taking place right now for banned substances, right? Here's the penalties for the first game. If for your first infraction, it's a 20-game suspension. For your second infraction, it's a 60-game suspension, and the third is a lifetime ban. Okay. This is a video on Mark McGwire, who broke all kinds of baseball records, 10, 20 years ago, actually. And this shows you the evolution of his changing, bodily physique, which we all know now is a function of substances.
In his baseball career, Mark McGwire was able to defy conventional wisdom, getting better with age. Now we know how he did it. Steroids and human growth hormones helped make him a home run king. His admission confirms what many had suspected for so long, what pictures made hard to ignore. Here he is with Jose Canseco in 1987 when McGwire won Rookie of the Year with the Oakland A's. McGwire played 151 games and hit 49 home runs. They were called the Bash Brothers, and it was years later that Canseco blew the lid off steroid use in the locker room, making him a pariah among players. McGwire says he first used steroids between the 1989 and 1990 seasons. Here he is in '89. Take a look at him in 1990. He says he returned to steroids after the 1993 season when he missed all but 27 games with a serious heel injury after being told steroids might speed his recovery. Here he is in 1995. In 1996, he's looking more muscular, his thighs more defined. In 1998, McGwire was a baseball icon, Big Mac, with a Paul Bunyan physique and a home run swing that made fans come out to the ballpark early to watch batting practice. His race with Sammy Sosa for home run record swept the nation. McGwire won with 70, breaking Roger Maris's single-season home run record. In 1999, he hit 65 home runs. 2000 and 2001, his stats fell dramatically. When he retired at age 38 in 2001, he played 97 games that year and hit 29 home runs. He was hired by the Cardinals in October to be their hitting coach. Myra Lopez, The Associated Press. In his baseball career.
There we go.
Well, now to some tarnished heroes on the diamond. Major League Baseball expecting to suspend some of its top stars as early as today because of their connection with a lab that specialized in performance-enhancing drugs. One of the biggest names on that list, New York Yankee star Alex Rodriguez. ABC's Paula Ferris has the very latest. A lot of people watching this one closely, Paula.
Yes, they are. Good morning, Amy. ABC News has learned that Major League Baseball still plans to announce these punishments and/or suspensions simultaneously. It could happen literally at any moment. And this morning, all eyes are on the highest paid player in the game's history.
Yankees third baseman Alex Rodriguez dodged questions as he drove off in his near $500,000 car late Wednesday. The highest paid player in baseball history is continuing a rehab stint at the Yankees training facility in Tampa, hoping to get back on the field after hip surgery. But this morning, there's a chance he won't return this season, if ever. In what could be the biggest scandal in sports history, as many as 20 players, including Rodriguez, have reportedly been implicated for using performance-enhancing drugs and getting those drugs from the now defunct Biogenesis Anti-Aging Clinic in Florida. Former league MVP Ryan Braun was the first to fall, accepting a 65-game suspension last week. But A-Rod is now at the center. Sources tell ESPN Major League Baseball now believes it has enough evidence of alleged doping by the star to impose a lifetime ban.
If they do, they know they're going to get an incredible fight with the union, and that's something that baseball is trying to avoid.
If guilty, this would be A-Rod's second offense. He famously denied doping in 2007 on 60 Minutes.
For the record, have you ever used steroids, human growth hormone, or any other performance-enhancing substance?
No.
Only to come clean to ESPN 2 years later.
I wanted to prove to everyone that, I was worth, and being one of the greatest players of all time.
This morning, sources say these new allegations are far more serious because Major League Baseball reportedly believes A-Rod not only continued to use performance-enhancing drugs, but that he interfered with its investigation.
Now, A-Rod's legal team has repeatedly said that they would appeal any suspension. However, ESPN's Outside the Lines reporting late last night that his reps are now negotiating a possible plea deal, which would still lead to a lengthy suspension. And again, Amy, any moment now this could happen.
All right, lots of.
And to a great degree, that ended his career, right? And then, 10 years later, it ended his romance with Jennifer Lopez. What can I tell you? Okay. So that was what he ended up getting, a 211-game suspension, which is the normal baseball season is 160 games. So you can do the math. All right. And here's, that's an asterisk. And the reason I put that there is, so and you saw that list of 20 odd athletes, and A-Rod was one of them, and including that now Mark McGwire, all of their records in the record books have an asterisk beside them, basically staining their achievements forever, because that asterisk says, that there was an issue with how, in fact, they obtained and broke those records in the book. All right. The MLB, the test for doping, so they're tested upon their first attendance at spring training. They're tested once more at random, only once, more during the entire season. They do urine, and now they do they do blood samples, because HGH, human growth hormones, you're only going to get those in blood samples, and that's really an advanced way to do a doping, basically. Here are the penalties for doping in baseball. The first positive test, 80-game suspension. We saw that for Colabello of the Blue Jays in 2015, the video I showed you. The second test is 162 games. That's the entire season, including the postseason. And the third time is a lifetime ban from Major League Baseball, right? The NBA have actually seen very few incidents. So either there is no doping or they're very good at hiding it, right? The penalties in basketball are, the first doping is 5-game suspension, plus you have to attend counseling. The second offense is a 10-game suspension, and again, counseling. The third time, this is a sport that gives you, 4 kicks of the cans. The third time is a 25-game suspension And guess what? You're going back to the same counselor who couldn't convince you to stop doping the first 3 times, right? And the 4th time is a 2-year suspension. So there is no lifetime ban in the NBA, no matter how many times you dope, all right? The NFL has the toughest anti-doping policy in professional sports, right? And that's good to know based on all the stuff we've seen with the NFL this season or this semester, right? So there's testing up to 23 times a year at random. And again, it includes urine and human growth hormone testing, right? And the penalties are the first time a 4-game suspension. You got to remember, the football season is very, very short. It's a dozen games. So, these suspensions are significant. The second is an 8-game suspension, and the third is a 1-year suspension, right? So those are good chunks of your season. The least demanding doping policy for professional sports is tennis. It's only been in place since 2010, right? Random urine tests for 25% of the players, which means you will not necessarily be tested at all, right? The first time is a no-name mandatory testing in the future. And let me just hang on a sec, guys. I apologize. Let me just go back here for a second. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not tennis. It's the CFL, the Canadian Football League. I wanted to get that right because I remember the CFL is incredibly lax. All right. So this is our equivalent to the NFL. So the CFL is the least demanding league for doping, only in place for the last 10 years or so. Again, random tests for only 25% of the players. They're random, so you have a 3 out of 4 chance of not being tested whatsoever. The first time you're caught doping, it's a no-name kind of thing, so it's not advertised that you were tested positive. You will be subject to mandatory testing in the future and optional counseling, and we see how well that works, in the other sports in the NBA. Second is the 3-game suspension, and the third is a 1-year suspension. Okay, golf, virtually never comes up with, nobody ever is accused of using a banned substance in golf. Although if you watch golf, and I do because I love to play golf, if you watch it, you can see that there are players. Bryson DeChambeau this year is about twice the size he was last year. His upper body is just like Mark McGwire. It's gone from being a relatively normal physique to being a monster, right? And you can see that. Now, this is Tiger Woods. Now, Tiger Woods isn't playing anymore. He may never play again because he was in a horrendous car crash about 2 months ago in California, where he crushed his legs and his arms and what have you, and his back damage. He already wasn't in really great shape. He's now in his mid-40s, so he's getting up there. For those of you who don't follow golf, Tiger Woods, before his whole world imploded about 10 years ago, he got involved in a sex scandal, and it just destroyed his career temporarily. Before all that happened, he was en route to be the most successful golfer in history. It's the one who has the most major wins in history. Majors are the U.S. Open, the PGA Tour, the Masters, and the British Open. Those are the 4 majors. Jack Nicklaus, who's now in his 80s, won 18 of those over his career. Tiger Woods has won 14 of those. And again, 10 years ago, before his world imploded, everybody expected him to basically achieve that, Jack Nicklaus's goal of 18 and surpass it. Now since he came back last year, he actually won the Masters. So he now has 15 major tournaments. But after this car crash he was in, and his age and the ability to recover gets longer and harder the older you get, nobody expects him to win 3 more majors to tie Jack Nicklaus. Here's a very brief video on somebody who actually thought that Woods was using performance-enhancing drugs.
Did you see that Vanity Fair thing where he looked like Evander Holyfield? Remember that Vanity Fair a few years ago, that article, the pictorial? Looked like Evander Holyfield chin-up bar? And for years and years and years, people emailed me. Wake up, Colin. You're blind. Look at him. Come on, he doesn't look like other guys. Water retention, blah, 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 blah. I, the entire time, said, dude, he's the greatest golfing prodigy of our life. Give it a rest. Golfers don't do that. But say it out loud. Great baseball player becomes greatest home run hitter ever, shatters records, falls off a cliff. Great cyclist becomes greatest ever, shatters records, falls off a cliff. Greatest golf talent, like a comet, becomes greatest ever, shatters records, falls off a cliff. Just saying. For 10 years, every call, every tournament, every cynic, every hater, I pounced on him. Fat guys in their 60s, the man who invented iced tea, they're playing 39 and Tiger Woods is shot. It would have been outrageous to suggest Lance Armstrong, whoa, wait a minute. He did. Barry Bonds, he did too. I don't know what happened. I went and looked at that Vanity Fair pictorial again today. I went to YouTube this morning. I looked up pictures. I'm just saying, 39. Greatest ever. Comet shatters records. Gonna quit? What are you saying? I'm saying the people that called for 10 years and connected the dots, I'm not so sure they were wrong now. Did you see?
Okay, so having said that, that was, again, that was a time after, he sex scandal and he wasn't playing and people thought he was washed up. But he actually came back, and again, as I said, he won the Masters, and he was still being competitive. And although we have all of these, these athletes, again, I showed you between Maguire and Rodriguez, what have you, who clearly were doping, and Lance Armstrong absolutely were doping. Nobody has ever proven that Tiger Woods was doping, and so he will never have an asterisk beside his name. It's just not going to happen.
See that?
Okay. Okay, and this is one of the last slides we're going to see, or video. This is for FIFA, for those of you who watch footy. So let's watch this. Oh, we can't. This is one of the ones that we have to watch on YouTube. So I apologize, guys. I thought I covered that, but I guess I didn't. So, all right, so let's finish off. There's only 3 or 4 slides left. So here's what the doping policy is at the Olympics. Obviously, that's relevant in Tokyo in another few weeks. So the testing is both blood and urine. The first 5 finishers in each event are tested, right? And the penalties are, the first time you're caught is a 2-year suspension, and the second is a lifetime ban, right? Here's what happened at the Sochi Olympics. So Russian doctors and athletes worked together to evade drug tests at the Sochi Olympics, passing containers of urine through a hole in the wall to replace tainted samples. This is washing walls, reported by the New York Times. Of the 247 tests overseen by UKAD, that's their agency, a doping agency in Russia, from November to early May, 99 were unable to be carried out due to the inability to locate the athlete. Right, that's pretty dodgy. While another test was refused, of those that were successfully completed, there were 49 positives, which is 20% of the total, including 47 for melodium. The latest allegations regarding the Russian athletes come only a day after the former head of the Russian anti-doping agency, Grigory Rodchenkov, admitted supplying drugs to dozens of medal-winning athletes and swapping dirty samples for clean ones during the Winter Olympics in Sochi. All right, and this is the report.
Midway through the day, the Deputy Director General of WADA was telling a story about how in the last few months, just as Russia was trying to prove to the world that it was cleaning up, some doping control officers were denied access to a militarily controlled city where some of the athletes were. They were told, you can't come in here without a 30 days heads up. So they convinced the athletes to come outside to test them. And as soon as they did, some FSB officials, the security services of Russia, showed up and threatened to revoke their visas. So the story, again, depressed people, frustrated them about Russia. But in that moment, ripples started to move through the room as word was landing that the New York Times had pressed send on a story that was incredibly damning. It was about the former head of the lab, the testing lab in Russia, admitting that dozens of athletes from Sochi were part of the state-run doping program, among them 15 medalists. This is key because until now there's only really been hard evidence about athletics, but this is now pointing the finger at a whole range of sports. And a former WADA staffer told us today, you know, this isn't a bombshell, this is a nuclear warhead.
Wow. So what's been the reaction from athletes?
Well, athletes very quick to Twitter. Haley Wickenheiser, you know, tweeted out, unbelievable yet believable. Becky Scott, who is the athletes representative at WADA, said, you know, this is stunning, and this is effectively, she said, this is exactly why we have been calling for an expansion of the investigation into Russia. And I spoke this evening with a man named Vitaly Stepanov. This is the key whistleblower who was trying to tell WADA for years what Russia was up to. He was a former doping control officer, very frustrated that no one would really listen to him. Eventually they did after some allegations went public in a documentary. But in terms of what the New York Times has done, he said in kind of in a weary way, this is what I've been trying to tell people. And his one hope is that the truth is strong.
All right, guys.
Midway through the day, the deputy director